Every journey begins from a single point. The beginning is often familiar, simple, and easy to navigate. As the journey continues, it often becomes more complex. The single road turns into several lanes and soon intersects with other roads. The further into the journey you continue, the more you rely on directions to navigate your way through uncharted territory. Time accelerates and takes on a life of its own. Witness what happens in this journey of life when the lives of 4 orphans are separated by a lost war, 8,000 miles, and 50 years, suddenly intersects for a purpose that they never realized was possible. And very much like life itself, it can feel like time is running out. During the Vietnam War, many American soldiers and other foreigners in the country fathered children with Vietnamese women. Many of these children were taken to orphanages. One such orphanage in particular serves as the centerpiece, the Sacred Heart Orphanage. The orphanage was one of the charitable institutions of the Sacred Heart Cathedral in Da Nang. The Sacred Heart Orphanage in Da Nang, Vietnam was where our connection began, where our intersections begin. This is the Da Nang Gang.
My name is Rachel Galvez. I live in Rye, New York, and I work in finance.
My name is Dan Brown. I currently live in New York, Queens, New York, and I have a small manufacturing business in Queens.
My name is Khan. I'm from Hartsdale, New York, and I'm currently the Executive Director of College Counseling at an independent school in the Bronx, New York.
I currently live in coastal Virginia, here in the beautiful coastal city of Norfolk. I do know that I was born in Vietnam in the summer of 1969 because I was about 2.5 years old when I was adopted and actually physically taken out of Vietnam.
I know I was born in Da Nang, and Da Nang was a big U.S. military base that sort of the northernmost part of South Vietnam.
I came here shortly before the war ended, about 6 months before the fall of Saigon.
Well, I was born in November of 1971 in Da Nang, Vietnam. And the day after I was born, my birth mother took me to an orphanage, Sacred Heart Orphanage.
First of all, I think it was always obvious that I was adopted, and it was never anything that was hidden from me. I did look slightly different from my family, or at least I felt I did, so I don't think it was as obvious to people on the outside as it felt to me on the inside.
I don't ever remember anyone telling me that I was adopted, but when you are half black, half Asian, and your parents and your sisters are Swedish and Irish, it's pretty obvious something's going on.
Unlike a lot of the adoptees, I have pretty extensive memories of Vietnam and where my birthplace is and how I arrived at the orphanage and how I came out of the orphanage. My earliest recollections of Vietnam are myself, my immediate family, which my mom, she was always by my side.
For Kirk, Khan, Rachel, and Dan, they grew up distanced from their Vietnamese community and even picked on because of their Vietnamese heritage.
I could just remember being in elementary school and they're like, oh, that's not your real mom and dad, is it? Because they don't look anything like you. And you know, of course, as a kid, you're gonna be like, oh, no, they are my real mom and dad. They raised me, and then be told again, no, you don't look anything like that. That's not your real mom and dad. That's not even your real sister. They're blonde hair, blue-eyed. So I can remember that. That was in elementary school. I think it's because, not because they were children, they understood the Vietnam War, but I think it's because they were being downloaded information and ideas about what the Vietnam War was and how screwed up it was and how, you know, all the negative connotations that come along with Vietnam kind of filtered through their kids, which resulted in them teasing me, calling me names. I wouldn't say it was racism. I think it was just a lot of hatred for the Vietnam War and anything having to do with Vietnam. or the last thing I wanted was to put my children in a situation that I was in growing up, where, you know, their kids find out growing up that, oh, you're part Vietnamese. It's them having to go through the same crap I had to.
And I have a wonderful wife and a son who's 5 years old, and this is a story that I want to be able to tell my own son, because he's going to ask at some point, hey, what's my story?
I just remember that feeling of me wanting to give my children a little bit more about my history, about where I came from. But at least I want them to know where Dad's home country was.
They've had to search for connections to their Vietnamese heritage. This search intersects with their own quest for identity and to understand what it means to be Vietnamese. Vietnamese society has existed for centuries, and for much of that time, our world revolved around the landmass and country that we all know as Vietnam. Though we often are extremely diverse, our ancient people include settlers from India, Africa, and other parts of Asia. Our people have also experienced integration from colonization and imperialism from China and the Western world, namely France. Vietnamese people faced with colonization, which sought to break down their society and remake their people to be good colonial subjects, had to work hard to identify that which was different from their colonizers, China and France. It became so important to have a concrete sense of what it meant to be Vietnamese and to be proud of that, to ensure that colonialism didn't erase what being Vietnamese meant. Years of Chinese colonialism, for example, motivated Vietnamese society to distinguish themselves from the Chinese and to memorialize and represent their society in a way that made them seem strong and independent. In many ways, this meant looking like a formidable enemy, that you couldn't just come in and take over, you couldn't just colonize. So Vietnamese identity, what looking and sounding and thinking Vietnamese was all about, started to be formulated, and this appearance minimized the diversity of Vietnamese society. Vietnam is considered a multi-ethnic country with 54 recognized ethnic groups, of which 53 are ethnic minority groups. But for most of the world, Vietnam is represented to be a monolithic society.
They're very non-diverse. They're kind of like the opposite of the United States when it comes to being a melting pot. They're not a melting pot, it's a rice bowl. And all you got are Vietnamese.
From Vietnam's history of trading with other countries, and from the many wars that have plagued Vietnam, this diversity has increased to include Eurasians, and with the Vietnam War, Amerasians. Many American soldiers and other foreigners in the country fathered children with Vietnamese women during the Vietnam War. The children, known in America as Amerasians, are called by another name in Vietnam, Bụi Doi, the dust of life, or more aptly, children of the dust.
As best as I understand, children of the dust is not a term of endearment. It is a derogatory term. Some might even look at it as a racist term. It's called children of the dust. It's just exactly as it sounds, that the children that they're referring to aren't worth any more than dust. And they're referring to children of mixed race that came out of the Vietnam War. They are looked at very much like a caste society. They are looked at as the bottom of the bottom. From what I understand, they weren't allowed to have high-paying jobs. They weren't allowed to go to school, get educations. They are the beggars. They are the hard laborers. They're the ones that are doing the grunt work that nobody wants because they are children of the dust.
In 1965, the United States sent the first American troops to Vietnam. These young soldiers landed on the beach in Da Nang to Vietnamese people who welcomed them with small tokens and gifts. By 1969, more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel were stationed in Vietnam.
Aside from the memory of my mom, which comforted me, and the hope that she provided in my mind, I was able to look forward to the soldiers coming and giving me candy and things like that. And they were our heroes. The children my age and older adored the American GI. I said to be American GI #1, no #10, you know. That's the adage that the kids would say about the American soldier.
At the heart of the conflict was a struggle between North Vietnam, that wanted to unify the entire country under a single communist regime modeled after those of the Soviet Union, and South Vietnam, which was working hard to create a democratic society.
When the war came, it came suddenly, and at night we would huddle in our underground bunker, and my whole family was in there. And you know, there's no lights or anything like that. I can see, and I can still see it today, how the dirt would shake from the ceiling.
Many people who lived in villages felt this pull and tension because they had Vietnamese communist soldiers, South Vietnamese Republic soldiers, and American soldiers visiting them constantly.
We would be visited by both forces, the American as well as the Viet Cong.
The arrival of Americans completely shifted South Vietnamese society to make room for and provide conveniences and services to American soldiers, military personnel, aid workers, advisors, and civilians. Impoverished women from the countryside migrated out to the cities where Americans lived for job opportunities that gave them the chance to support their families in villages and learn new skills. For many of these women, it was their first time away from their families and their first time in jobs that were so different from the communal family jobs they had grown up doing their entire lives. It gave them a sense of independence living far from their families. When a Vietnamese woman earns money, it's not just for her, it's for her whole family, and there was never enough to support everyone.
So in the history books, at least that are mass-produced for kids in this country, you have a sense of maybe what the Vietnam War was about. But you don't have a real appreciation of all the different layers and the complexity. And for whatever, I don't know what the official stance of the United States government in terms of why we were there, but when you get to know the people involved on all of these different levels, you have a different appreciation for the Vietnam War.
In 1973, Richard Nixon announced that Americans were withdrawing from Vietnam.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
With that, Americans started leaving, the jobs started drying up, and women were faced with extreme poverty living in the city with dwindling job opportunities. It also brought the threat of the advancing North Vietnamese army and the potential for an end to the war that South Vietnam would ultimately lose. This brought fears of how that loss may look based on stories that people had heard about the communists who were regularly infiltrating villages and what had happened during the Tet Offensive. The fear was near panic, and women were probably terrified that their children would be severely discriminated against. Colonialism, imperialism, genocide, and the Vietnam War displaced so many people in Vietnam. Like no other time in Vietnamese history, the climactic ending of the Vietnam War disrupted South Vietnamese society. People fled the country en masse, but not everyone could leave. Many were too poor to make it to the boats, the helicopters, the planes. For those who were left behind, they quickly learned that survival meant a Vietnamese identity that was as distant from Americans as possible. Many people lived in extreme poverty in the cities during the war. This was especially true after South Vietnam had to shift to an economy devoid of Americans. Jobs that were available were very demanding of women in their time. Many women were raising children on their own because their husbands were soldiers for the South Vietnamese. Soldiers did not make a lot of money, especially after the U.S. withdrew financial support. You had South Vietnamese soldiers subsisting on a diet of rice and fish sauce and some vegetables. Women were often responsible for supporting their children, their extended families, and their husbands. Orphanages became a place where women would take their children, sometimes for the day, sometimes for the week, and sometimes for months, so that the staff at the orphanages could care for the children while their mothers worked. They would return to retrieve their children.
So the moms would come there and use the facilities They bring their children to play with the orphanage kids.
I mean, I'm so thankful for the orphanages that, really cared for us, because, we would have been left on the street, and some babies were. And it wasn't always because of the shame. It was also because, I think in my family's case, they were very poor, and as I understand it, it would have been very difficult to take care of me.
Orphanages also had children that had been abandoned or whose parents had died. So you had a diversity of children in the orphanages. Those that had no parents were adopted out to families. Some of these families were Vietnamese, especially after the war. Many of the families were foreigners, such as Americans.
I was in an orphanage for the first 2.5 years of my life at Sacred Heart Orphanage in Da Nang, so I do know that. I know that I was adopted by an Army major and his wife who had wanted a child, and they adopted me and another little girl, an infant girl. Now, I do know that it was assumed that both my parents were killed. I don't recall, I honestly do not recall my adoptive parents or anyone telling me your parents were killed, but I do remember asking my dad about it when I was very young, probably in elementary school. What happened to I called it my real mom and dad because I didn't know any better. And I remember him saying, well, if that was during the time of war, they were probably killed, and that's why you're in the orphanage.
And I think that challenge probably started at home because, when you obviously don't look like the people you call family, that was not easy. That was not easy. Growing up in this small farming community wasn't the most diverse place in the world. I think the elementary school that I went to was mostly white and mostly Mexican American. So I don't remember being around a lot of black kids or Asian kids as a young person. And that was always a little bit of a challenge.
I remember they said that this is actually your new family. This is your new family that you would live with. And in my mind, I was like, I already have a family. They were in Vietnam. You don't know what that means when they say this is your new family and these are the people that you live with. Your mind doesn't connect. My adoptive family, it wasn't a pleasant experience. The family was very dysfunctional. And I found myself 6 or 7 years after my adoption, I found myself having to go and get a job and supporting myself. I was in the 8th grade when I found employment.
I was adopted as a 1-year-old, and the first place I lived was New Haven, Connecticut. And even now, as I've spoken more about my story, there's people I grew up with that said, I had no idea that you were adopted, I had no idea that you were from Vietnam. I didn't explore this a lot, but more recently, or as an adult, I do feel different because I have no biological relative.
For Rachel, she found out she had an Amerasian sister who was raised by her mother.
I mean, there were parts of me wondering, it'd be really nice to be related to someone. And when I was pregnant, I thought, wow, this is the first human being that's going to be genetically related to me, my sons. And they're, sort of thinking, is there somebody out there that's related to me? It wasn't an extensive search. It was me, putting a little saliva in a thing and sending it out and not expecting anything. And then the summer of 2017, I was in the car and I get, my husband was driving, and I get a message on Facebook Messenger, and it says, I just took this DNA test, and it says that says Rachel Galvez is my aunt, and I don't know how to put this together. We're going back and forth, and she says, well, my mom and I immigrated from Vietnam, and I said, well, I was adopted from Vietnam, so this is obviously a close relative on the Vietnamese side. And I kind of get the goosebumps, and she said, my mom said that she had a baby sister. They never knew what happened to this baby. So they went home that night, I guess, and my birth mother, who still lives in Vietnam, they called her and said, what was the name of the baby that we lost? And she said, Nguyen Thai Kim Hung. So I go, and I had forgotten my Vietnamese name, but I look at the documents and it says Nguyen Thai Kim Hung.
Through connecting with her sister, Rachel discovered how Amerasians struggled to find a place in the Vietnamese community.
The story with them is they grew up in Vietnam, and My sister did, and she's older than I am, and also half white, and had to live through kind of going to what they call them re-education camps, but basically hard labor camps and poverty, and was never allowed to go to school, and was bullied, and people threw rocks at her, and so that she just grew up in this horrible existence from the way that it's described.
For Kirk, his mother came to him in a miraculous reunion.
I was actually in Tennessee at the time that the test results came back. My middle son was graduating high school, so I went to Tennessee with my son, two of my sons, to go watch him graduate, and had my phone with me and got a notice, an email notice. So I looked down at the phone like a bad father. In my son's graduation, I'm sitting here looking at my phone, and the email is not from the DNA company. And an individual, and the first name is spelled NGA, and that last name is Niblett. So I thought, well, that's a weird name. And then the subject title line said, looking for my son. Now, when I saw the name NGA, I immediately assumed it was an African name. Less than 5 minutes later, I get another email alert. My son hadn't walked across the stage yet, I will say that. So I was like, oh, well, he's not walked across the stage yet. They hadn't started the diploma, so they're in the middle of some kind of boring speech. So I looked at the email again, and it says it's for family tree DNA, FTDNA. And it said parent-child match found. I was like, how is that even possible? So I opened the email, and it says parent-child match found, here's the match. And it's the same name of that email I'd just gotten 5 minutes before. And it was at that point I was like, whoa. I'm like, that's not an African name, that is a Vietnamese name. And it dawned on me like, holy crap, parent-child match. And it's a female. I'm like, this is my mom. I'm like, DNA doesn't lie, but there's still part of me saying, there's no way, this is impossible. There is no way this is possible. So my attention span at that time was shot. I found out that this woman, whose name it's pronounced Nai, was a Vietnamese woman who for the past 40 some years had been looking for her son. You know what's crazy? She had put in that test 2 years prior to me putting in for it. She put in for AncestryDNAaswell.com. She told me after the fact that she would check those sites 20, 30 times a day. She would get up in the middle of the night looking.
Many connect with other adoptees and Amerasians.
I discovered Vietnamese adoptee Facebook pages in, I guess it was 2017. And it's the first time I ever talked to another adoptee, and this is all on social media. So it was amazing to me that there are all these other people like me out there that I had never known about or met.
I've been involved with the adoptee community for quite some time, but I went on one gathering. I wouldn't even call it a reunion. It was a gathering of maybe 6, 7 people.
The first time I actually met other adoptees was going to a reunion where there were probably 50 people who had been adopted from Vietnam, from various orphanages, some from Sacred Heart. But it was the first time I was actually immersed in an environment where we all had this profound and very similar experience.
And I didn't have a real positive experience. I couldn't say that I made a connection or anything like that, simply because it's what's in your mind that connects you, you know? It really is. And it's not where you're from necessarily. What's in your mind? Because I've met other adoptees that I can't connect with. Their mind is a little convoluted in I don't know what it is. It may be life, or maybe it's they had some really tough beginnings where they couldn't overcome it, you know? And I feel for them. I know what it is.
That experience of being with those adoptees was great because I began to understand better what it meant to me to be adopted and to be adopted from Vietnam. And I didn't realize, but there had been a whole community of adoptees that had been getting together at these reunions for years. I didn't know about it. Here I am in my early 30s, this is my first experience with it, and it opened up a whole world to me. the whole world, new people around the country who had this same profound experience.
It's just the way that things came together and the way that we were able to connect are nothing short of miraculous. To be able to sit in the same room and talk about our life experiences growing up, even though we grew up in different parts of the country, grew up with different professional backgrounds, the similarities are amazing. And I think what helps with this group as far as bonding, not only our similarities and our backgrounds, it's the way that we process things.
Yeah, 50 years it's a long time, and I just met the Da Nang Gang. I met a few here and there, and I've corresponded, but this is actually the very first time that I've met people from Da Nang, and that I can connect with them.
I guess obviously I'd known there'd been a lot of babies adopted out of the war, but I had never connected to any of them or even spoken to them or known about these organizations. So I was sort of active on these pages and looking at my paperwork and finding out which orphanages I was in and kind of thinking, oh my gosh, this person was in the same orphanage that I was at the same time. And it was just really fascinating to me. And a lot of them look half Asian, but most were adopted to America and Australia, Canada, and Europe. So you have these people that look half Asian or even full Asian, full Vietnamese, with very American names, and a lot of similar stories.
Many returned to Vietnam in hopes of finding that connection.
She wanted to take me back to Vietnam because I still had a lot of cousins that lived over there, nephews and nieces, and people that I never even met. And she wanted me to go back home.
I remember coming home and I remember saying to my parents, I need to go back to Vietnam. Like, it's time for me to go. Mother says to me, we have been saving money since you were a kid, just in case you wanted to go back to Vietnam. We knew that there was a chance you might want to go and we didn't want it to be a financial hardship. So we have the money.
My husband and kids and I flew to Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. We went from Ho Chi Minh City up to Da Nang, where I was born, and then my birth mother lives in Nha Trang, which is between Da Nang and Ho Chi Minh City. It was surreal. I can't even explain it. It's crazy, but there's definitely a connection. There's so much emotion in looking out and seeing, I guess, kind of palm trees and things, and just thinking, wow, I can't believe. It's sort of part of my blood and it's part of my history. And I do know when I was landing in Vietnam for the first time, there was a feeling of like, I'm coming home. I learned a lot more about the story.
I remember thinking about it for a few weeks and then just thinking, I don't think I can go back to Vietnam by myself. This is going to be an incredibly emotional trip. How do I go to Vietnam, have this emotional experience, and come back and try and explain it? Like, how am I going to do that? So my adoptive family goes with me to Vietnam. And this is December of 1998. And now the wheels are in motion.
And you buy a plane ticket and you go to Vietnam and you walk on the land that you were born in. Because when I went back in 2002, I was so elated to actually be there. It makes it real. It completes you as a person.
This is as close as I've ever allowed my adoptive family. Because now they're seeing me raw with emotion as I'm experiencing Vietnam for the first time. I'm going to walk the streets that my birth mother walked as I'm going to this orphanage for the second time.
It's like being in love, So you can read about it in a book, but it doesn't mean anything until you're actually in that moment.
And at this point, my friend Twee and I are roommates. And I said, I need to find Sacred Heart Orphanage. So she gets on the phone and calls information in Vietnam. And they put her through to Sacred Heart Orphanage.
Unbeknownst to me, the orphanage is still in existence over there. Now, it's not an orphanage per se now, it's a school for disabled children.
So for me, when I went back, I felt it was real. And when I stood in the orphanage grounds, I can imagine myself being there when I was young.
I was shocked to learn that there are 2 nuns there that were there when we were there, that took care of us. One was in her 80s, the other was in her 90s. I was shocked that they were still there.
For the nuns that we met at Sacred Heart, it was huge for them. Partially because they loved it when kids would return to Vietnam. It helped to validate the sacrifices these nuns had made. Like, they were Catholic nuns and dedicating their lives to helping kids, and here was one of those kids returning. I think the other moment that was so great in this experience of going back to Vietnam was actually seeing my name in the registry.
I knew that the registry existed. I knew there was a registry there that the nuns had handwritten all the names of all the orphans. I was able to look through there and find my name. That was powerful.
The nuns had kept really good records throughout the war, but I think at the end of the war there was a concern that the communist government would come in and destroy the records, take the kids who had been left at the orphanage, and so the nuns copied down this registry in another book and hid it, and were able to bring it out to show me.
I think the only thing I could equate that to is people going to Ellis Island and finding their ancestor's name in the immigration registry there at Ellis Island. Seeing my name in that registry was a validation of my existence, that this is real. This is not all made up. This is not supposition. This is a written record, the first written record of my existence in this orphanage.
It's real. It's not something that someone made up, it's real. And that was powerful.
I want to continue to go back to Vietnam to see my birth mother as much as I can. I want to go back and visit Sacred Heart, which I didn't do. We hope to go back as a group together. I think that would be, just an amazing experience to go back with fellow adoptees.
I would say wholeheartedly, to complete that person, you must go to Vietnam.
For those who couldn't leave in 1975, they later fled by sea as boat people. Much later, Amerasians came to the United States under the Amerasian Homecoming Act. All of these Vietnamese refugees brought their identity into the diaspora where they built their community anew. They did this by connecting to one another and building closely knit communities all over the world. But how can orphans, who are completely disconnected from their birth mothers and from the Vietnamese community, also do this?
There's a big void inside each and every adoptee, and I understand that better than anybody. And all I ever wanted was to actually find the family, find whatever it is I had lost 50 years ago.
When your existence or the way you move through the world is so different from your own parents and your sister, I don't think I felt like they really understood the kinds of things that I might be thinking about or dealing with or going through. You're doing what you can to fit in, and you're trying not to stand out in many different ways. And I think, like a lot of kids, I just tried not to stand out too much.
That's why people need to have teams. They need to feel like they're a part of something,
Sometimes when you're adopted, there's this push-pull. You're trying to do everything you can to be a good kid, to be a good sibling, to be a good son, because you want your parents who've adopted you, you want so badly to be kept. But on the other hand, I found myself kind of pushing back against, pushing back a little bit, almost testing them, trying to figure out, well, what are the limits to this relationship? What are the limits to this love?
I've never been a whole person. And, every day I wake up and I think about this here.
It's given me just a very profound sense of appreciation and gratitude that I've tried to have. It hasn't always come naturally to me. I work on myself. I've been in therapy, I do yoga, I read Oprah, all this, think positive and all this kind of stuff. And so, but it hasn't always come natural to me. But having this actually happen to me really has given me a profound sense of appreciation and gratitude for my life.
And I was asked It's amazing how awesome is this. Describe that phone call in one word. What do you think, what feelings you have? And the feeling I have is tragic. And I say that because as a father, I cannot imagine my child being taken away at birth and never seeing him, not seeing him for almost 50 years. I can't imagine as a parent. So even after all these years hearing that, I feel pain, but it's not my pain. It's the pain of a parent who's lost their child.
For the Da Nang Gang were the poorest and loneliest members of the Vietnamese community. Their magical recipe turned out to be building and creating a community together and bonding, like family, with hopes of inheriting or discovering the parts of themselves that make them Vietnamese and that connect them to the Vietnamese community in Vietnam and in the diaspora.
It's amazing because, the odds of meeting one person I thought were great. But then when the universe started opening up, it's just the way that things came together and the way that we were able to connect are nothing short of miraculous.
I met some adoptees who'd all been in the same orphanage at the same time. They all had there was a nice connection there. And this is, to me, it's just a miracle that you've got all of us who are in the same orphanage in Vietnam in the late 60s and early 70s meet for the first time 50 years later in New York City.
I think at this point in time, the timing is right. The Da Nang Gang itself, it's a little rare for me as far as the adoptee community. The three that I've met, Rachel, Kirk, and Cảnh, they're special people. They actually are special people, and that they have things. I'm sure they have things, quirks, and things about them, but I can overlook that easily. But the underlying thing is they're good people. That's why I'm sharing my story.
Nice meeting you. I'm like the old man in the crowd. I can't believe it.
Sense of gratitude has led me to the realization that I've got blessings that need to be shared. I got blessings to be paid for. And part of doing that is helping others like us, like you and I, who have been adoptees our whole lives growing up with those issues, recognize those blessings. Recognize that it's not all doom and gloom, that it's not all a sad story. It doesn't all have to have a bad ending, that there are blessings that we have just by the very fact that we're alive. It's just a recognition of that. So that was important to me. The blessings of being able to reconnect with my family, being able to help other adoptees that may be just starting that journey or don't know what to do with that journey.
I also know that other people have come into my life where they are, I'm not going to say inspired by it, but certainly I'm giving maybe voice and words to what they are thinking and feeling, but perhaps haven't said or haven't realized. And so I'm hopeful that in some small way it helps other people process the things that they're thinking about or struggling with or trying to figure out, particularly around identity and around adoption.
And I think we all complement each other well, and we have a common desire and goal to give back to the community. And I think, we're all professionals and we also have families, but driven really to give back and do something with the opportunities that we've been given. So we started this foundation. We got as I mentioned, we had put the paperwork in the fall, I think, of 2020. And then we got our 501c3 in May of 2021.
The whole thing with the Vietnam veterans, that came about through the research we were doing for the documentary, because I was shocked at the amount of healing that was happening with our veterans that visited us during the war. Because what I found with them is many of them were suffering PTSD, anxiety, and that whole dark path of not knowing what happened to us, not knowing what happened to you and me. Were we one of the ones that were shot and left for dead? Were we the ones that were the child of the dust that are left begging the street? They didn't know what happened to us. But what I found is when they are reconnecting with us and realizing, oh my gosh, these kids have a good life. They are living the dream. They are making something of themselves. It's been healing for them. And you're talking about a whole generation of young men and women that were sent to war and had to abandon it at no decision of their own. To me, it would have been a disjustice not to recognize the need to show them the respect, the honor they deserve, and to help them heal through seeing life through our eyes and seeing, as I've heard so many times from some of them, that nothing good ever came out of that war. And I say, I challenge you. You look at me, you look at my kids, you look at the life they're living, you look at the life that we never had it not been for that war. Something good did come out of the war, and they're seeing that. So being able to provide them with that type of healing has been amazing.
In this newer stage of my adulthood, understanding the value that Vietnam vets have for me and that I might have for them. So when this idea about C2C Foundation was first being discussed, C2C Foundation is a way for me to be involved in the veteran community. Hearing from those Vietnam vets what their experience has been like serving in the military, we have generations of we have generations of veterans who are also dealing with similar things and challenges to overcome having returned from conflict somewhere. And so when this idea came up about C2C, I thought, well, this is great because there's no doubt the piece, the mission that covers reuniting families, sure. That's been something I've been talking about and interested in for a long time. This is a no-brainer. But it was the Vietnam vet piece for me that was most intriguing because that's not something I've been involved in so much before. And I love that. I love that. And as I'm working with vets, particularly Vietnam vets, I'm thinking about my father who may still be out there.
In recognizing PTSD through my own experiences, through law enforcement, and recognizing PTSD and the symptoms and the methods of healing for other veterans, we've expanded the mission for the foundation to help not only veterans of the Vietnam War, but any war, and even active duty military who are coming back from the combat theater and suffering with these emotional issues. So we've developed programs to help them realize that there's still good in this life, there's still beauty in this world, and that there are a lot of things worth living for.
The Da Nang Gang, I think these three would be my lifelong friends from this point on.
We talk a lot about the Vietnam War, we talk about Vietnam adoptees, but this goes way beyond that because it's a message of hope, it's a message of healing, forgiveness, and acceptance. So I think that if this can be used as a catalyst or an example, a role model of never giving up hope and being able to find forgiveness in your heart and being able to accept people for who they are, we need to run with that.
Where do I go? How do I help myself with all that I carry? What does it all mean? I do not know if I can do this alone. It's getting too heavy. I'm at a crossroad. I need someone to show me just where I turn. Can anybody hear me? This pain, it burns. I need some hope, something to hold on to. I'm getting weak on this slow one-way street. It's heavy, and I can't seem to let it go. And my mind, yeah, it's scary. Sometimes it would last so long. Taking it all in my mind gets a little crazy sometimes. And I just want